are in listen-only mode.
All right, guys, here's what we're going to be discussing today. Let me go ahead and get us over there. It seems as you guys, most of you guys will totally agree that nowadays it's almost as if you have to have a PhD in pitching mechanics to understand. We make it so complex. We make it so technical. And at the end of the day, that, in my opinion, is the number one reason why so many parents and coaches struggle, because at the end of the day, it's a communication issue. Anytime the body is not clear of exactly what it's to do, it's going to appear in the form of inefficient movement. But more times than not, it's the kid getting blamed for being uncoachable, for not being athletic, when really it's a communication divide. And that's what I'm going to help you with today. And personally, that's why I wholeheartedly believe the only way to teach pitching mechanics is to teach a pitcher to feel the move, be able to describe it in his own words, and then watch it. So really what we're trying to do is we start everything with the goal and work backwards. The goal never changes. It's the variables around the goal that actually changes. And I'll show you some examples as we move forward. Now, before we get started, go ahead and go to baseballthinktank.com/ABCA. It was during the American Baseball Coaches Association that I presented Prepare to Feel Invincible. It was in front of 7,500. It's the largest coaching clinic in the country, and it's attended by coaches worldwide. So I was very excited. I actually was able to mark this off my bucket list. It's something that I've wanted to do for a very long time, and to be able to share that stage and to share your message with that many coaches from around the world that are just as passionate as myself was a very special event and time for me. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So over the next 35 to 40 minutes, you're going to learn why these two 17-year-old kids could throw the ball 100 miles per hour and hit a baseball 503 feet. Now you're going to see on the left is Lantz McCullers. This pitch right here was 100, I believe it was 100, close to 199, 100 miles an hour. And then on the right, I've got Bryce Harper. I've actually flipped him over to the right side just for comparisons to show you how similar the lower body to the pitcher and a hitter is. Really, the only difference is the plane in which they move. Next up, we're going to talk about how this guy right here on the left was throwing the ball 93 miles per hour in late June. Then on the right, he was 97 3 weeks later. But what I want you to really look at is watch the difference in the arm action, and we're going to talk about that later on how he actually changed what many believed wasn't possible, his arm action, and most importantly, he did it in the middle of the season. So how was he able to do that? The key points of discussion for us is why the inverted W is not an arm action issue, why the 10,000 hour rule is a myth, why just a longer stride doesn't increase your velocity, neither does hip-shoulder separation. I know that's going against a lot of girls' beliefs of what you've been told, but I'll tell you why later. Why arm speed should be the goal, not arm strength. You got to think about it this way. Arm speed is instant. Arm strength is not. The number one reason pitchers struggle to transfer and command higher velocity to the mound, you're going to find that. The two biggest mistakes you could ever make with mechanics, chasing the symptom versus the cause, and number two, making the product the goal versus understanding how the goal has several products. So I'll make that a little bit more clearer. But what we end up doing is with hip-shoulder separation, that's actually a product of the main goal. So we should never really make hip separation shoulder the primary goal. And then finally, how to create your own system to cheat the development process without ever mentioning the word mechanics. Now, one quick prediction before we get started. I'm waiting any day now for Twitter to announce itself as the official sponsor for the Velo Games. And last but not least, I actually just saw a news flash that the Olympic Committee has announced that travel baseball will be the newest individual sport. All right, chapter 1. You're going to see throughout this entire presentation how heavily Paul Nyman of SetPro.com influenced my beliefs on mechanics. I can remember reading Paul's stuff for hours. As a matter of fact, my wife caught me in front of the computer several times past 2 o'clock. I was actually embarrassed that I was still looking at pitching. Like I told you, I'm obsessed with pitching mechanics. But she thought, what grown man would be down here in the dark looking at a computer screen? And let's just say she accused me of looking at naughty things. So call that pitching porn if you like. But anybody knows me knows that's absolutely not the case. So I can actually joke about that. But one of the key points he said was there's a difference between knowing and understanding. And I think that's a fine line that many never see clearly. Now, my story is I started coaching at the college level at 29 years old. But what was really tough about that, I was a single dad with a 4-year-old daughter, and I wanted it bad enough that I actually quit my job. I mowed yards and I scraped up change constantly because at the time I was selling industrial supplies, and people that know me would probably laugh at that because I still to this day have a hard time determining the difference between a wrench and a screwdriver. And it was actually my best friend that had offered me the volunteer job. Yeah, it was a volunteer job at a high school. He had just gotten the job. He needed some help, and I thought, why not? I'm going to go for this. So at the time, I started mowing yards, and I can remember I was a father of a 4-year-old daughter at this time, and just scraping up change in between the seats because in baseball, whether it's high school or whether it's college, you're not in it for the money. If you are, then you're going to be a broke man for the rest of your life. But it wasn't until I met Luther Bramlett, who was a head coach at St. Catherine College. We'd been watching a baseball game, and after the 9th inning, we'd been talking pitching for close to 3 hours, and he offered me the job. It was an unbelievable opportunity. I mean, heck, here I was getting $300 a month, and then he gave my daughter the education of a lifetime. So you can only imagine how rich the learning environment was for a 4-year-old little girl walking around, living in a dorm room with junior college baseball players. It was amazing how quickly her vocabulary exploded and the new words that she learned, some French, some Spanish, I guess you could say. It opened a few eyes whenever we'd go to Walmart or some of the other places, and she was talking like a junior college pitcher. So you wonder why she hates baseball? Now you know. Now, during this time, I would read anything and everything I could get my hands on. Maybe you guys do the same thing. You scour the internet, but what I always found, it never failed. The more I started to dig into pitching mechanics, the more confused I became. But I had a desire to learn as much as possible. My early influence was Tom House. If you guys know Tom House or have read any of his information, you know it's very technical. It uses a lot of anatomical terms, and if you're not careful, you could actually do more harm than good, because unless you understand, like Paul said, there's a difference between knowing and understanding. At this point, I knew, but I didn't really understand. But there were a couple of times, you got to think, let me back step one real quick here. With the junior college pitching staff I had, let's just face it, they weren't there on academic scholarships. Many of my guys had a hard time remembering when was the War of 1812, and I could actually go into a longer story, but I won't, of how I had to break up a fight between two of my junior college pitchers because one believed that Abraham Lincoln's beard was still growing. And after I broke up the fight, the head coach asked me what was going on. I said, well, they got into a heated discussion over a history lesson. But with Tom House, again, it was Riley and I in the dorm, and each night as I put her to bed, I would start to dig into Tom House's information. But there was a communication gap, and how I was able to overcome that communication gap to help me understand was I would actually take Tom's information, make up bedtime stories, and try to communicate that to a 4-year-old. Again, just one more reason why Riley hates baseball. But there were two questions that kept constantly popping up, and it was driving me crazy. Why were my 5'8" guys throwing harder than my 6'8" and 6'11" guys? Why wasn't the longer stride transferring to velocity games? Because that's all I heard. Now, over time, what I realized now looking back was that I was pretty good at teaching my pitchers how to do the wrong things right. I was guilty of spreading verbal viruses. This is what I refer to as cues, and I'm going to show you in a second how deadly those can be and how they lead to disease mechanics such as reach out, get extension, stay tall, stay back. These are some of the worst things you could ever tell any of your pitchers, and you'll learn why here in just a little bit. But again, it was communication, and the next 3 quotes that I'm going to share with you would forever change the way that I view the development process. Number 1, and how true. If you've got a pen beside you, please write this down. Until a pitcher can feel what you're asking him to do, he will never truly understand. This is Tony Robichaux. Tony is a good friend of mine. He's one of the winningest college coaches of all time at the University of Louisiana Lafayette, and just a brilliant pitching mind. Think of it this way. If you've got 5 kids, all from different countries, all speak a different language, and you're trying to explain, let's say there's a stove in the room, how hot is the stove? Well, they're not going to know. They're going to all they're going to guess because they have no idea. They're going to look at it. They're going to take in information. They're going to try to process it just like we do every day to come up with an answer, but they're speaking in different languages, so they really never know. But not until you actually have each one of those guys go up and touch the stove Will they truly understand what hot means? And from that point, they could all speak in their native language, but everyone in the room would know exactly what they're referring to. So the body's going to respond to feel for good or bad, and I look at feel as the body's native language. It is the key communicator, and something very, very interesting. Most studies will show that the general population, about 45% will be auditory or visual. So you're looking at 45, 48. And then that final 2 to 5% in the general population will be kinesthetic. Now in baseball, I've tested this well over 1,000 times, and it's pretty cool looking over the results. That only about 2% of baseball players are auditory learners. Usually that's split about 48, 48, 49 each will be kinesthetic and visual. So really cool, and how important feel is. And then this last year I host Pitchapalooza, which is the largest pitching coaches clinic in the country now. And presenter after presenter, Scott Brown from Vandy, Eric Cressy, Derek Johnson, were all referring to the importance of proprioception, which I refer to as feel. Now, Dr. Alan Seals, who's the top neurologist in the country, he's a director of neurology at Vanderbilt Medical Center. I like to refer to him as a Palooza legend after the speech he gave us this year. But he tells us muscles don't have memory, but the brain does. That goes against what you've been told. Everybody talks about muscle memory, but that's not really how the body and the brain work or connect to develop pitching mechanics. And then, again, here's Paul Nyman with setpro.com. The body will organize itself around its intent. He's the one that coined the intent to throw hard. Intent, if you're not familiar, is simply the goal. What is the goal? And we want to make sure that we state that the intent as clearly as possible, because you have to remember, again, I would suggest that you write this down. We never change the goal. We keep our intent the same. What we're going to do is we're going to change the surrounding variables, because I believe as a coach, your job is to do two things. Number one, the best way to communicate is by asking questions. But number two, it's more so a guided discovery. We're not going to change the goal. We're going to change the variables around the goal to see what works. All right, now, first and foremost is when we're looking at pitching mechanics, you have to understand the why. Why does this kid throw the way he does? Why does he do some of the things that he does? Because it could be pretty dangerous just going in and changing pitching mechanics without understanding why he throws the ball the way he does. First, let's take Bartolo Colon in the right-hand corner. Most of you guys, if you saw Bartolo Colon, he's got a very short arm action. Now, why does he have a short arm action? Is it something that you would change? Well, the story on Bartolo Colon is that in his younger days, growing up in the Dominican Republic, his job for the family was to throw rocks at coconuts. He had to bring home coconuts for the family, and by the looks of his body, he thoroughly enjoyed coconut pie. But you think about what that would take, constantly, day after day, one, knocking down one of those hard coconuts. So I'd have to throw the rock pretty hard. Secondly, I'd have to have pretty good command to be able to consistently hit the coconut. So over time, it would require an arm action like you see with Bartolo Colon. And then below is Goose Gossage and his wild delivery. But he says he remembers, this was during his Hall of Fame speech, he remembers throwing as hard as he could to his brother in his yard, and his brother would say, "Hey, you're a sissy, you're a sissy." And so what he would do, he found a way to create as much energy and momentum through the ball as possible, and he credits that to his wild delivery. So understanding the why is very important. Now here is my guy. This is little Rex. This is Rex at 4 on the left. He was throwing at 40 miles per hour. And then here's Rex at spring training last year hitting the ball. We call this the Marinovich Project Part 2. Hopefully it ends a lot better than the first one. But the thing with Rex is he's never received one single instruction except for throw it as hard as you can, swing it as hard as you can. I don't care if you hit the ball, because one thing that I would want to avoid, and this is a very, very key issue, is that you wouldn't ever want to associate the results, like say he hit the ball very far. And let me back up. Whenever Rex would swing and miss is when I would give him the biggest praise. I would give him the high five, because I wanted him to understand the importance of the process. He could control swinging as hard as he could. He couldn't control how far he hit the ball, because as you know, it's pretty difficult to hit the baseball. It's one of the harder things in sports, but he could understand the process. And what I'm trying to do is just organize two things. Number one, understanding the process, and two, really trying to convey the importance of intent, of swinging it as hard as you can, throw it as hard as you can, because those are patterns that are developed at an early age that will appear later in life. They'll stay with you. And I'm a big believer that most velocity is coached out of kids. I think that the level or the ceiling for velocity is much higher than we give it credit for. It's not so much genetic as is what is learned in early life. So telling these younger guys to swing it as hard as you can, throw it as hard as you can, and not getting caught up with the results really helps shape powerful movements and mechanics that will benefit them later in life. Now, next up is something that we did, and looking back, it really changed a lot for me. The first was Rex. As he was 2 years old, 1.5, he would come in every day, and he would sit for Indian style for hours watching guys like Josh Donaldson, watching a lot of my major league pitchers throw over and over. And so they would get into velocity, and he would watch them. So he sees them throwing hard, so he jumps in line. Here's this 2-year-old. He jumps in line. He's throwing the ball 19 miles an hour. So after velocity is over, I see him. He's still throwing the ball, but now he's throwing it at a wooden mound. It's going bam, bam. It's a real loud, echoing sound. And I noticed it looked like he was throwing the ball harder. So earlier in velocity, he was at 19 miles per hour. I sneak over behind the mound and start to record his throws whenever he's getting that loud echoing sound. And suddenly that 19 went to 22. So what do? We do what any redneck family would have done, and we go to Walmart. We get this big blue pool. We put it out in front of the yard. The neighbors absolutely loved the look, and his job or what he liked to do each day was to go out and throw rocks at the pool with one single command: throw it as hard as you can. And his goal was to throw a rock through the swimming pool. What I learned from that is just the importance of sound. And again, the goal never changed, but we realized by changing the sound, it really encouraged and promoted him to try to throw the rock harder because he wanted that reward for the sound, the echoing sound, and the sensation of throwing the ball harder. Now, this one is very, very important when we think about pitching mechanics, when we think about instruction, when we think about coaching. It's the fact that everything affects everything. Inside pitching mechanics, it's total chaos. I refer to it as a butterfly effect. And most often, it's the smallest, most overlooked flaw in your delivery that leads to the biggest issues that you have. And we're going to just explain that here in just a moment. But let me flash back. Over my 2 years at St. Catherine, I look back, I was just lucky to have so many good athletes because my lack of understanding of pitching, I just really didn't know the difference between knowing and understanding. And I can remember my wife and I writing letter after letter to these colleges. And again, I didn't understand how hard it was to get into college baseball. So here I am writing these letters and not getting anything in return. And as we were mailing them out, I remember we had $75 in our bank account at the time, and we were spending $45 on mailing out. And as I was walking to the mailbox one day, I had a letter stick to my foot. And I'm thinking, wow, this school must really suck if it's stuck around. So I ended up throwing it in the mailbox. 2 weeks later, I get a call from an assistant coach that I had met, and he asked if I would be interested in the volunteer job at Lipscomb. So I say, yeah, I accept it because it was, again, another opportunity of a lifetime. It allowed my family and I to move to Nashville on absolutely no money as a volunteer. And it was ironic to look that the letter that was sticking to my foot was Lipscomb University. So you're going to hear my daughter. She just actually walked into the room and she's aggravating the dog. So if you hear that, please kind of overlook that and we'll keep going. But like I said, 2 weeks later, I accepted the job at Lipscomb, and the Nashville Hillbillies arrived. We actually pulled in on 3 wheels because the car that we had was an old Chevy Cavalier, and it looked exactly like this. I found the picture, but we were just happy to be in baseball, and I had the opportunity of a lifetime to actually start at the Division I level at Lipscomb University. Now, at this time, I was a pitching McAddict, and I think that's what we have a lot of guys do, is that we make them so thought conscious of pitching mechanics that they simply can't move. Everything and anything and everything is blamed on pitching mechanics, and that's where I was at this point in my career. So I arrive at Lipscomb as a volunteer. We eventually get married. I've got no job. Well, I've got a job, but no money coming in. Here I am. The only thing that I'm worried about is I'm still searching for answers on why my smaller guys threw harder or why the longer stride wasn't adding up to higher velocity, because, again, this is what I had read over and over and over. But what I didn't know was that I was focusing on the product and not the goal. So I was constantly watching video, and I only wish that I'd heard this back when I was spinning my wheels with video. and that was Butch Thompson. He says, I'm 43 years old, and I can't repeat my signature the same way twice. Now, Butch is another guy, a very close friend of mine. He's the head coach at Auburn and one of the brightest pitching minds in the country. And what I'd like for you to do after this is, or maybe while you're doing this right now, as you're sitting here, take out a pen and paper and let's write your name. How many times have you written your name? I'm 43 years old. Let's say that I've written it 10,000 times a year, easily, 430,000 times. Yet I still cannot repeat that single simple movement that I've done over and over that can be accomplished while sitting in a chair only using one body part, but yet I can't repeat it. So how can we expect these kids to repeat a delivery that requires millions of simultaneous coordinated movement patterns firing with under a second? It's just not ever going to happen. So if I can't be able to do that, what we're doing is, especially when we get into video and we're emulating or comparing these young kids and we're saying, hey, here's Tim Lincecum, here's how he does it, here's Aroldis Chapman, here's how he does it. And we think for some reason that if these guys can look like this and throw the ball hard, then all you have to do to throw the ball hard is look like this. So think about it another way is, if I can't sign my name the same way, how am I going to sign Tim's name or Aroldis Chapman's the same way as he does when he can't even do it? So in the end, we're really setting these kids up to fail without realizing it, because that's conventional wisdom nowadays. It's the idea that emulating another person's mechanics is beneficial, whereas I think that could be at a very early age, but the older the pitcher gets, the more ingrained his mechanics are and the more unique they are to him, that we're just setting these guys up to fail, and emulation becomes more of imitation versus emulation. But thank God for Derek Johnson. Again, I've been blessed to call some of the brightest, biggest names in pitching my close friends, and Derek's just another one. Derek is the pitching coach of the Milwaukee Brewers. He left from being the pitching coordinator with the Chicago Cubs, but he gained his claim to fame when he was at Vanderbilt, and he had guys like David Price, Sonny Gray, Mike Minor, and just name after name that were first rounders, and they're now big league stars. But we had just signed this kid, and I sent over a video to DJ in slow motion, because that's how I watched video. And he says, well, is there any way you could send this in real time speed? I need to get a sense for his rhythm, timing, and momentum. And that's when it hit me. I'm thinking, pitching is all about momentum. It's all about the flow. It's about the rhythm. And here I am watching it in slow motion over and over. And anytime that you're watching pitching mechanics in slow motion, you're conditioning, you're training the pitcher's brain to think positions, you're training the brain to think mechanics. And whenever this happens, they become thought conscious. It affects performance. It affects velocity. Because if I'm having to think about it, then my body's naturally slowing down to make that happen. But DJ's been one of my biggest influences, if not the biggest influence. And it was DJ and Paul Nyman that led me to the concept of peer pressure, which I'm about to share with you. Now, one thing that DJ taught me that was very, very important, and this is a very easy way for you to begin to evaluate and analyze pitching mechanics. Watch how the pitcher travels foot to foot. Another thing that you're going to watch, and we'll talk about this here in a minute, is just going to be the knee. But whenever you see the foot and you see that he lands on the toe, the heel is showing, obviously that leg cannot stabilize itself. But what we've done in the past, and I've been guilty of, if I would see a guy flying open, if I would see something with the foot, well, I'd put a board there and say, hey, don't fly open, don't do this. But what I didn't realize is that everything affects everything, and a pitcher will travel foot to foot, meaning if you see him go to the ball of his foot, he's pushing off from the ball of his foot. If you see the leg start to swing open, it's simply because his weight is on the heel. So just watching the foot is a great starting point for what's going wrong and where you could start. So whenever we look at the front leg, and we talked about the knee just briefly, usually when you watch the knee, think of the knee as a snitch. It's going to tell on the surrounding joints. It's going to tell you what the hips or what the feet's doing. You see the first image, that's a stable front leg, and the lower body of the leg, we want that stable. That's our foundation. Think of that as the first story of the house, and if I can keep that stable, well, then I've got a better chance for rotation. Now, anytime we see that knee start to move forward, we call that buckling, and whenever that happens moving forward, most times these guys are trying to push, and this is when we start to get into shoulder issues and throwing with all arm. And then finally, whenever you see that knee start to slide sideways, those are guys that really struggle with understanding the difference between spinning and rotating. Rotating means they're able to segment the rotation, whereas spinning, the body is spinning all as one piece. Big difference there. So whenever we're trying to understand the concept of peer pressure, first you have to realize the arm has peers. There's good ones, there's bad ones. The eyes are by far and away the most influential because the body will follow the eyes. It's the brain's right-hand man. It's a survival instinct, and it's just how we're hardwired. Next up is the center mass. That's from the top of the belly button to the thighs, and it's the greatest influencer. Learn to control the center mass, and that's when you're going to see good things happening. That's when you're going to see less stress on the arm. That's when you're going to see less thinking on mechanics because your focus is just to move more efficiently. Now, something that's really cool is that the quickest way to speed up velocity is to speed up the center, because as the center starts to move faster, it gives the arm no choice but to move faster. It almost gives it an impression. Well, what you're trying to do is give it the impression that it's running out of time. For example, if I told you you've got 30 minutes to get to class or you've got 30 seconds, which path would get you there quicker? Obviously, you're going to find a way to take shortcuts if you only had 30 seconds versus 30 minutes. It's the same thing with pitchers. Whenever you see guys that do not control the center, they don't know how to move through the center efficiently, well, the arm's just simply going to loiter. It's going to hang around because at the end of the day, the arm is at the mercy of the hip. So some other peers would include your feet and your glove side. Now, whenever we start to analyze pitching mechanics, if we see an issue on the right, you're going to check the left. If you see an issue up top, you're going to check the bottom. If you see it at the bottom, you're going to check the top, front, check the back. And what we're doing here is we're trying to run out of possible solutions. We're working backwards, and we're trying to identify the cause. And whenever we start to do that, you never have to mention the word mechanics, because as we work backwards, you're going to see it's the smallest detail that affects the biggest changes. And it's something it's something we overlook because we want to make it so difficult. Now, earlier I discussed cues and communication. And this right here goes in, it's going to explain cues, the danger of cues, meaning, hey, I want you to reach out. I want you to get a longer stride. The longer stride should never be the product. It should be the goal. And what's going to happen is he simply gets a longer stride, but at what cost? It's forcing him to push off the back foot. You see the front leg breaking down, and there's no rotation present. Next up is what I call the elevator effect, and this is a prime example of peer pressure. Whenever you see this knee, and watch as this pitcher goes, immediately starts to open the front leg. As this front leg opens and rotates, well, the back arm, it's its peer. So we're going in this X pattern here. The arm is going to go the opposite. It's going to move linear because this is rotational, and because this is opening, the arm is just going to drift, and it's going to try to say, hey, well, more so than anything, without getting too technical, it's just going to be very passive, because anytime this starts to open and I'm not using the center to project down the mound, this movement is much slower. If he were to keep the knee closed and move through the center of the body, he would move down the mound much faster. But being that he's moving slower this way, it gives the arm a chance to do some nasty things, loiter, just kind of hang out, and it ends up becoming a very inefficient way to throw the ball. So if you see an issue with the arm, my first check would be the leg. Always check the front knee. Now, here's one that you see all the time. And this move right here, when you see the guy leading with the hips or pushing the hips out, which has been taught for years, has created a generation of front hip dominant pitchers. What I mean by that, it's just the opposite. Energy, power is transferred from back to front, whereas when I'm starting in this position and simply pushing the hip out, it's going to force the pitcher to swing the front leg open. And this is one of the main primary reasons that you see so many guys that push the ball and end up with shoulder injuries, along with it being a growing killer, because it's not a very efficient way to use the hips. And we call that loading the hips. Now, here's an example of pushing with the hips, or the cue of loading with the hips. You'll see this yellow line. Whenever you see these hips start to mirror this yellow line, they're simply pushing it. Think about the mound. The mound is a slope, so we want to mirror the plane of the slope. If a guy pushes, he's going to push sideways, and his back knee, his back hip, it's going to lock out. So what happens? Well, now suddenly the front leg, the front hip is responsible for rotation. So I compare it to just crashing, like you'll see with this roller coaster. As we start up the hill, we start to move, begin down. They're crashing. They're simply pushing themselves off the track. Now, here's another thing that exemplifies everything, affects everything in peer pressure. As I mentioned earlier, watching the feet. This is a guy that normally rotates extremely well, but his dad sends me a video and he's wondering why he's running off the mound, meaning why is his momentum taking him in a straight line versus rotational? Well, everything affects everything. Look at the area that he has to pitch without knowing. His body is simply trying to protect itself. And it's really, really cool when you start to dig into pitching mechanics and realize that so many of the pitching flaws are just based off human survival. It's the body's number one goal is to protect itself, and it will go to great lengths of doing so. So simply by throwing in a box like this with hard concrete surrounding you, without thinking about your body's trying to protect itself, it doesn't want your hand to hit the wall, so it's going to make changes to your mechanics in order to protect itself, and that's what's happening at all times throughout the pitching delivery. So it's something you need to keep in mind. And now, 3 big mistakes that I made quite often, over and over. Number 1, I coached by cues. And like I've said 3 times already, when the body is not clear of what it's to do, it will appear in the form of inefficient movement. That was David Ray. David is one of the guys that really changed my outlook on pitching mechanics. He's a brilliant strength guy. He handles all the performance and movement programs for our professional guys. So he's a guy I would definitely check out. He's got a book called Baseball Movement Essentials. It's one of the best I've ever seen. Now, mistake number 2 was focusing on the product versus the goal. For example, get a longer stride, get hip-shoulder separation, early momentum. It was all those cues that the kids simply didn't understand, and that's why their mechanics looked like they did. But again, fortunately, I was blessed to have some very good athletes. If you're not in that same boat, then you can only imagine how bad inefficient communication coupled with kids that struggle, it's a disaster. It's a recipe for disaster. Now, mistake number 3 was focusing on the symptom versus the cause, and I see this all the time. You will especially see this with the inverted W. You'll see guys that will focus on the symptom. Now, the symptom would be the inverted W. His arm's not in a position to throw, so what do a lot of guys do? They'll actually place balls underneath the arm to keep the arm. They'll constrain the arm from elevating. So their goal is to keep the ball underneath the arm. Well, they get pretty good at keeping the ball underneath the arm, but as soon as that ball is taken off or get to the mound, what do? They have never identified the cause. They haven't fixed the cause, so the symptoms start to appear again. Another one is hip-shoulder separation. And you can see with this kid right here, he's got the inverted W. He's got no hip-shoulder separation. The hips haven't begun to turn. And then a week later, his dad sends me the video. The inverted W is gone. The hip-shoulder separation is present. And it was a very, very small change. All we focused on was keeping the weight in the center of the foot longer, whereas before he would get to his heel and it would just block his hip. So we just made a simple change with that, and it ended up making big changes with his delivery and his overall velocity, not to mention his arm health just felt so much better after making that very, very small change. You just got to remember, everything affects everything, and if you're able to identify the cause without focusing on the symptom, good things will happen, and it's usually a very easy change for these pitchers. Now, another way that with the inverted W, and you hear this all the time, and here's another example. With this guy, inverted W, you can see how low the arm was. Here we're using the core velocity belt, and it was just more of learning to move more efficiently through the center of his body, and you can see how the arm action started to change. Now, another very, very important point whenever we're discussing pitching mechanics is the body craves equal and opposite. It craves balance. Another quote from Paul Nyman. And here's some examples. Watch Clayton Kershaw as he takes the ball out of his glove. Watch what his front leg does. Same thing here with Jeremy Papelbon. As he takes the ball out of his glove, the direction that he takes the ball out of the glove, that front leg is going to move in the opposite. It's doing this for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's trying to balance itself. By moving the front leg in the opposite direction, it keeps the center in the center. And then here, let's go back. Well, I showed Roy Oswalt and another kid doing the exact same thing. But it all goes back to the concept that all roads cross through the center of the body. We often give the legs all the credit or the arm, but in baseball, it's a rotational sport. And anything and every move that we make requires the hips to be able to rotate. So our energy transfer is going to be through the center of the body. And I often look at, well, I'll go to this in here in a second. Let's flash back for a second before I get ahead of myself. While at Lipscomb, during one of my nearly 1,000 lessons, literally it's what we do every single day. It's how I was able to make a living. Everything changed for me. I'd picked up my daughter, Riley. I'd pick her up from school after daycare at 5:30, and she would head to the gym. So she was responsible for entertaining herself for hours. Here's a 4-year-old girl watching her dad do lessons. She's bored. She hates baseball. So she gets pretty creative. She still to this day has a very creative mind. But she takes off her shoes. She takes the old tubing that everyone would use for arm care. And she's small enough that she, instead of wrapping it around her wrist, she puts it around her waist. She backs up from the wall. Remember, she's got her shoes off. She's got on socks, and she would jump down to her butt and she would water ski. She would slide across the gym floor. Now, she was doing this for hours, and I'm thinking, wow, what a cheap babysitter. It's awesome. There's no background checks. The tubing has got me covered right here. So she continues to do this. I'm going through my lessons, and suddenly I hear a pop. And I'm thinking, oh my God, my daughter is dead. I look over there. She's peeled. She's stuck against the wall. And so I'm panicking. I run down there. I'm thinking, oh my God, she's dead. My heart's racing. It's beating. And as I'm getting halfway down there, the freaking pitching coach pops out at me, and I think, man, that would be perfect for pitchers. So I, like any concerned dad would do, scrape her off the side of the wall, and we head to Walmart to get a back support brace in hopes of replicating the same device and using it for pitchers. And it was that discovery that led to why most pitchers cannot and won't ever transfer velocity gains to the mound. I mean, it's because of that center part of the body, and it was something that I learned from my 4-year-old daughter slamming into the wall. Now, here's Dr. Seals again at Palooza 15, and he says, many, if not most, players have poor proprioception, kinesthetic awareness of hip movements. What he means by that, one of the first things they do with stroke patients is to take their shoes off to make them more aware. And typically, it's the center part of the body, the hips, that control movement, as you know, but that's where they struggle, and they're learning to walk again. So they put their emphasis on taking the shoes off and focusing on the hips. And he thinks, well, that's not what he thinks, but he says that the core velocity belt is one of the primary reasons that it works so well, is because it provides such kinesthetic awareness to hip movements. And it's the reason why so many guys struggle. So why is the center so important in the sport? As we mentioned, baseball is a rotational sport. The hips control locomotion, they control direction, acceleration, deceleration, and then they're basically the fuse box between the upper and lower body. So no matter what I do with my legs, if I'm not able to move efficiently through the center, well, then all momentum, all energy transfer is lost, and it's having to start over again. And that's why you see so many guys, so many young pitchers especially, throwing the ball with all arm. So whenever I mention the center mass acting as a fuse box, what I want you to look is on the image on the right, and you're going to see a red cord on each side of the fuse box. Now, you can take either side and say that's the legs, that's the arms. So as that energy is passing through, if there's a fuse in that short box, there's no way that energy is going to transfer to the other side. And that's my visual of how the center part of the body is to work and why it's so important. Now here's Scott Brown. As you guys, if many of you guys know, he's the pitching coach at Vanderbilt. He's one of the top pitching coaches in the country. Here he's using the core velocity belt. And over and over, I've heard him say this 1,000 times, you've got to move through the center. He was just playing how he uses the core velocity belt with his pitchers at Vanderbilt during Pitch-a-Palooza 15. Now, mistake number 2 that I want to discuss, and that's the product versus a goal. And it's a big mistake that I made often. And I made it very early in my career, and I did it for a long time. Think about the longer stride. Pitchers with longer strides, such as Chapman in velocity, in his higher velocity, guys say, well, he's got a longer stride, so that's why he throws with higher velocity. Well, that's not really the case. It's because he's able to move more efficiently. If you'll watch his delivery, he moves so efficiently through the center of his body that he creates more momentum. He's able to mirror the slope of the mound versus pushing outward. So he's gaining momentum the entire time. The added momentum increases the longer stride. The added momentum increases the arm speed. So it's actually his ability to move through the center. That's the goal that appears with the products of a longer stride and higher velocity. So again, that's focusing on the product versus the goal. And the pure pressure effect would be more momentum equals longer stride. Gives the more momentum, the faster I'm moving, influences the arm to move faster. And it's really just the body's built-in mechanics. It's the body trying to protect itself. Now, with my smaller guys, and I mentioned at the very beginning why I had some smaller guys that could run the ball up to 88, 90, 92 miles per hour, and none of these guys were over 5'9". But think about it with your smaller kids. These guys are having to compete at an earlier age, whereas the bigger kids, it's easier for them. They've got more strength. So the younger kids are more aware of the center of their body, and they just move more efficiently than most of the taller guys. And then at the same time, your smaller, shorter guys aren't told to stand tall. They're not told to throw the ball downhill. as much as the taller guys. So they're not coached up. They're not introduced as cues. They're not overcoached is probably the best way to say it. And they naturally found a way to generate more force and more arm speed simply by moving through the center of their body more efficiently. And getting back to Dr. Seal's lack of proprioception, the reason so many guys will push their hips, number one, it's the cue lead with the hips or load the hips. And then number two is they simply aren't aware of how the hips are to work. So getting back to one of the first things we discussed is how was this guy able to increase his velocity in a matter of 5 weeks or less and change the arm action? Once you learn to control the center of your body, and I'm talking about from the belly button to the top of the thigh, if I can start to move faster, and then obviously a couple of things are going to happen. Number one, I'm going to be more efficiently getting from A to B. Number two, I'm going to give the impression that to my arm that it's running out of time, so it's going to take a shorter arm stroke. But there are several products, or there's several ways you need to look at this. What is allowing him to do this? Number one would be staying flatter on the foot. Number two would be sitting deeper and longer with the glutes. And then last but not least is a secret that I won't share today, but it's something that we discussed at length at the latest baseball think tank certification. And it was just an eye-opening aha moment for me that I'll be sharing later. But guys that were at the certification can actually see why this was able to occur. Now, another thing that I'd like to discuss with you is the velocity. Now, you're going to see with the velocity started in March 14, it was 94. By September, it was 96. It actually increased throughout the entire season. But the cool thing about it is we never mentioned arm action. We never talked velocity or mechanics. Our simple goal was to get hitters out, because at the major league level, if you're thinking mechanics against the best hitters in the world, good luck. You're already beat. There's probably somebody already warming up. But there's absolutely no reason, and this is a big myth, there's absolutely no reason to believe you lose a feel for the strike zone as your velocity increases. Guys say it all the time, hey, my velocity increased, I lost my feel for the strike zone. That's not true. It's your training, because you can see with this young man, he had 53 strikeouts to 17 walks as his velocity increased. And as a matter of fact, he was one of the top relief pitchers in the league that year. So if it's that easy to transfer and command velocity, why can't everyone do it? Well, Dr. Seals, I'll let him take over again when he says the most efficient and effective training of any skill will incorporate understanding of how to increase kinesthetic awareness and also incorporate appropriate overload training for associated stimuli. So let me show you what he's talking about. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we never change the goal. What we do is we take the goal and we try to create an environment as rich in sensory perception as possible. We want them to see it, like Rex throwing to the swimming pool. We want them to hear it, and we want them to feel it. And pretty soon, that's naturally how our body learns. That is something that I go in depth. The entire pitching mechanics mastermind system centers around my 4-step process for teaching pitching mechanics by feel. And it comes down to two things on how the body learns. Number one, quality trumps quantity. The 10,000 hour rule, it's just not how the brain works. It's not like I can go in and punch the clock for 10,000 hours and I'm going to come out an elite athlete. It just simply doesn't work that way. A couple of ways that we do it. Number one is hip proprioception by using the core velocity belt. We'll do some overload, underload training. We spend a lot of time barefoot. Some tools that we use would be the radar gun. It would be the swimming pool. It'd be different sounds. We go barefoot. And then the only way that I have found for a guy to actually feel the center part of his body, the most important aspect in mechanics, is by using the core velocity belt. I'm going to show you some ways that we do it and some ways that some of the top college programs in the country do it. Now, here's a guy, and this isn't, don't think that you're going to get on the core velocity belt and you're going to see the same results. I'm simply using this to show you what is possible. You see he's got on the belt, he's throwing. We spend a lot of time training velocity off the mound. We try to make it as rich in sensory perception as possible. We're throwing it to a spot. We're seeing the gun. Now, the first pitch was thrown at 80 miles per hour, no strike. The second pitch, what we've done is we've overloaded. We've taken the strongest tubing strength that we have, and he's thrown, and suddenly he goes from 80 to 85. Now, what I don't have shown here is we would actually take the red, the lightest tubing. So we went from no belt, heavy belt, lightest belt, and on the lightest belt, it was 86 miles, or it was actually 85 miles per hour. And then we immediately take it off to increase the proprioception, the feel, and you're going to see he throws the ball strike at 86 miles an hour. So he's went from 80 to 86 in a matter of 4 throws just from becoming more aware of how to manipulate and control the center part of his body. And here it is again, just showing him on the 4th throw. So if you want to write this down, we go no belt, strongest tubing, tensile strength, which is going to be blue or black for you, and then the lightest, which would be red, green, or yellow for some of you guys. Now, here's what's so cool about this, and here's where we go wrong. We're constantly talking about arm strength when, in essence, it's really arm speed. Arm speed is instant. Arm strength is not. You want to think about whenever we're overloading and underloading the hips, why it works is the athlete can feel it. The body's forced to move faster. It gives the impression to the arm that it's running out of time. Inside our training environment, we're actually training from the mound where you're going to be pitching. And we're also training to throw strikes. So if you're in a training environment that makes such a big aspect of development, we overlook that. You see guys all the time that are throwing running guns. And sure, I like to do that just to have fun with it, but it's not something that we do on a regular basis. As a matter of fact, if we've ever got a guy, there's more than a 3 mile per hour difference, we'll actually take the running guns away from him because I like to see the max running gun, the max throwing the velocity from the mound should never be more than 3 miles per hour. But at the end of the day, it's all about creating an environment that's rich in sensory perception, taking the goal, attaching what the player feels, what he sees, and what he hears to the goal. And then we also, from a different aspect, we're using the mound, we're using the strike zone, we're using the radar gun. So how does this type of sensory perception inside your training environment speed up the development process? Well, it's providing crystal clear info to the brain. It's crystal clear information. There's no confusion. Therefore, the body's going to move more efficiently when it understands. So if you want to throw more strikes, train to throw more strikes. You want to transfer velocity to the mound, train from the mound. You want to increase your hip awareness. The only way we found, use the core velocity belt. And anytime you can include sounds, feels, and visuals to the goal, now you're connecting perceptual stimuli to the overall goal, and that's how you're going to speed up the learning process. So here's some examples of how we create a training environment rich in sensory perception, and you can do the same thing. First, you've got to remember the body works as a system. It's usually the very smallest detail, smallest change that affects big changes, and I would always start with the eyes, and then I would go to the feet. Why? Simply because the eyes is the brain's right-hand man. The feet are what's going to help transport us. And keep in mind, we've got piers. So the piers to the center mass, the hips, are going to be the eyes, and it's going to be the feet because they're in the center of the body. A couple of ways to really increase feel or awareness is point to the center part of the body, touch the feet, draw a spot on the foot. You're going to see here that we're doing some medicine ball training. This major league guy here has his shoes off, and instead of throwing the ball straight ahead, it's more of a rotational where he's slamming the ball next to his feet or his foot simply to increase hip awareness and the awareness of rotation. Now here's Justin Grimm with the Chicago Cubs, and you see him using the belt inside his training environment. Next up is Jake Stinnett. He was a first rounder out of Maryland, and this is actually part of his warm-up prior to throwing. He's using the core velocity belt. He's focusing on rotation. Now here's Auburn, how they're using the belt. You're actually seeing he's got the belt. Part of their warm-up is as he's trying to mirror the slope and move forward, the pitcher behind him is actually trying to prevent him from doing that. And then they're using this to increase mobility of the hips and also just train the feeling of hip-shoulder separation. And this is something that Auburn does on a daily basis. So really, at the end of the day, what you have to understand is that your results on the mound are a direct reflection of what you're doing off the mound. And in order for anything to happen, you have to create an environment that's rich in sensory perception. So one thing I want to discuss, and that's our throwing program. If you want to increase your velocity, the first thing you want to do, be the guy nobody wants to throw with. If you pick up a ball and others ask you to throw, well then, sorry to say, but your throwing program probably sucks. You want to be the guy that when you pick up a ball, people run for the door. If you're that guy, then you're probably getting after it the right way. Next is compete in empty rooms. It's so easy to compete in front of coaches when you're going to get praise and a pat on the back. But what are you willing to do when nobody's watching? If that's the same, well, then you've got a chance. And then last but not least is just the mental side. Number one is breathing. That's the invisible bridge that connects the mental to the physical. If I can learn to breathe, I relieve anxiety, I reduce muscle tension. And let's face it, loose muscles are fast muscles, tight muscles are slow muscles. And then it's the idea of meditation, breathing, and putting it all together because it's the loudest performances are orchestrated by the quietest minds. The less you can think about your mechanics, the faster that you're going to move, the higher the level you're going to compete, and good things are just going to happen. So at the end of the day, your velocity, arm health, command is at the mercy of your hips. And if you want to learn more about the core velocity belt and why it's used by well over 200 schools, including 2 of the World Series participants and 7 Major League Baseball organizations, go to baseballthinktank.com/CB belt. Talk soon, guys. Thanks. Are you kidding me?